I'd like to also start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands with which we meet. For me in Adelaide, it's the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today I'm going to be talking about two pieces of work we've done at CSIRO. The first bit was to look at the inclusion of environmental sustainability into food-based dietary guidelines around the world. And then we did some modelling to look at how our diets in Australia compare to some global recommendations in the Planetary Health Reference Diet, as well as our national dietary guidelines. So first things first, the review of inclusion of environmental sustainability in food-based dietary guidelines around the world. So global food systems and the way we eat really needs to change for it to become more sustainable if we are to safeguard our healthy food supply as well as our individual health into the future. Lately, we've heard a lot about the fact that a radical transformation of the global food system is needed. The way in which we eat drives the demand for food and influences global food systems and production of food. And the production of food is actually one of the biggest contributors to environmental degradation around the world. So how do food-based dietary guidelines fit into these? The food-based dietary guidelines are one lever in this complex food system. Food-based dietary guidelines are national government-endorsed documents that provide advice at a population level around foods and dietary patterns that promote health and prevent disease in the population. They are intended to establish a basis for public food and nutrition, health, and also agricultural policy and programs. However, traditionally, these food-based dietary guidelines have really been developed in the context of human health, and increasingly it's acknowledged that the health of the planet needs to be considered and addressed if we are to have a safe and secure food supply going forward and for our next generation. I guess the good news is that in terms of what we eat, there are many synergies between a dietary pattern that is healthy for humans and healthy for the planet. So making food-based dietary guidelines is an excellent opportunity to inform and educate on this issue of healthy diets from a sustainable food system. The FAO has suggested that countries who are developing or revising their dietary guidelines need to consider sustainability, and it needs to be incorporated in an effective way. So effective from their point of view means informative, highlighting the links between food, health, and sustainability, so these three pillars, and how that can benefit making changes in those areas. They also need to be accessible and appealing, country-specific, and provide clear guidance on how to make changes to adopt a more sustainable dietary pattern. There have been others who have examined the inclusion of sustainability within food-based dietary guidelines. There was a review by Gonzalez, Fisher and Gunnett in about 2016, who found that only 4 countries, which was less than 5% of the guidelines that they included, incorporated sustainability into their guidelines. And this includes some unofficial guidelines as well from non-government organisations. A more recent review by Martini looked at how the key recommendations in dietary guidelines compared to the FAO guiding principles, and they found that there wasn't actually good alignment between the information in dietary guidelines and these guiding principles for a sustainable, healthy diet. So with this in mind, we conducted a review of food-based dietary guidelines around the world. And the aim of this review was really to assess the inclusion of environmental sustainability messaging within food-based dietary guidelines around the world and the depth of coverage against these FAO guiding principles for a healthy, sustainable diet. And I'll go through those in a minute. There's 16 different principles and they span a few different areas. So this is directly from the document. We call it the snake, but it's 16 guiding principles to a sustainable, healthy diet. You can see they start off with number 1 around breastfeeding, and then the other health-based principles include things like related to food processing, to try to have a variety of unprocessed or minimally processed foods, moves into some more specific advice around plant-based foods or limiting animal-based foods. And then it gets into some principles regarding environmental health, So environmental impacts, number 9, diversity, minimising the use of antibiotics and hormones and packaging, and then through to socio-cultural aspects. So ensuring they're accessible, they respect local culture and cuisine. So in our review, the FAO website has a great list of all the countries around the world who have food-based dietary guidelines. We were able to, so I've just got all these pop-ups everywhere. We were able to locate 83 countries that had food-based dietary guidelines. We were looking for any kind of guideline document. So this, as you can imagine, there's documents that are quite short in nature, and then there's some quite lengthy documents like our background documentation for the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So each country was able to, or we included a background document, which was the lengthier document, and a consumer style document, which tended to be the briefer document in our review. The food-based dietary guidelines needed to be coming from the government body or endorsed by the government. We took the guidelines that targeted the general healthy population, so not for infants and not for pregnant women and that kind of thing. And the guidelines that we included were those that made reference in any way to any depth, made reference to environmental sustainability. And you can see the various search terms there at the bottom of the screen. So in total, of the 83 countries that we were able to locate food-based dietary guidelines for, 37 included some aspect or some mention of environmental sustainability, and there were 17 consumer style documents and 32 background documents. So this figure just shows the most recently published guidelines from each of those countries. So 37 of the 83 included sustainability, which was about 44%. You can see the darker blue shows the guidelines that included environmental sustainability. And you can see from about 2014, there's obviously a lot more darker blue, indicating that the majority of guidelines published, newly published dietary guidelines, made mention of environmental sustainability from 2014 onwards. We also found that some guidelines haven't been updated for quite some time. In 1991, Venezuela actually addressed one criteria of sustainability around culture. But more recently in 2021, Denmark has published their guidelines, and they have addressed health and sustainability equally across all aspects of their dietary guidelines. When the presence of environmental sustainability was explored by the region and also the income level, we found that countries from Europe and Central Asia were most likely to include environmental sustainability, and upper and middle income countries were also most likely to include environmental sustainability. Firstly, there were a few countries, the lower and middle income countries were less likely to have food-based dietary guidelines, and they may have been more likely to focus on adequate nutrition and getting adequate nutrients as opposed to environmental sustainability. So this graph shows how many of the FAO guiding principles, those 16 principles I showed you before, were addressed in each of the countries' food-based dietary guideline documents. So the reddy pink colour is the health-related principles of that snake that we were looking at. The orange is the environmental, and the green is the socio-cultural. So, and across the board, the background documents tended to address more of the guiding principles than the consumer documents. And, you know, this is partially explained because they were a lot larger and comprehensive documents. So essentially there was more space to cover more things. It was most common for the issue of culture to be addressed in the dietary guidelines, followed by those recommendations about consuming more plant-based foods and limiting animal-based foods. And then the common environmental type aspects that were covered were things around the direct environmental impacts of diets, preserving the biodiversity, and food waste. So what we did was we graded or assessed the inclusion of each of the 16 guiding principles in both the background document and the consumer document for each country, and we gave them a total combined score, which you can see on the right. These 4 countries, Denmark, Belgium, Italy, and Sweden, had the greatest coverage of environmental sustainability across both the background and consumer documents. And Denmark, Belgium, and Italy, I guess, have been the most recently published dietary guidelines. Australia made mention of environmental sustainability in the background document only. That's why consumer documents sort of got that grey colour. And when we did it quite well, scoring 21 out of a possible 64. We covered the what, why, and how, but not so much the quantity advice. So we also looked at whether guidelines just addressed what about environmental sustainability, or what is environmental sustainability, why people should be interested or care or change their diet in relation to that, but then also really importantly the how to do that, how to achieve dietary change, and then whether or not dietary guidelines provided quantified or quantitative advice for people to follow. And you can see that the quantity column, so the 4th column in each of the consumer and background documents, tends to have the most red colouring, and that's because this was the least well covered aspect of the what, why, how in the dietary guidelines. So just some examples of how these kinds of things were covered in dietary guidelines. Plant-based foods, that aspect of the guiding principles was covered. The what, the why, the how, and the quantity were all covered in the Belgium dietary guidelines. So in terms of what, an example, eat proportionally more plant-based than animal-based foods. Why should we do that? Legumes tax the climate less than most animal protein sources. Legumes can be stored for a longer period of time, don't require transport, and the transport doesn't require cooling or speed. How should people do that? They can serve soup or puree, or make it spread it on bread. And what should they do? They should eat legumes weekly and use them to replace meat at least once a week to increase your protein intake. So quite specific advice there. Denmark covered the 4 aspects of what, why, how, and quantity for the animal-based guiding principle. So their what was eat less meat. Why should we do that? Cutting down on meat also benefits the climate. This applies to all types of meat, in particular beef and lamb, which are common foods with the highest climate footprint. How should we do that? Choose legumes and fish, introduce a meat-free day, and cut down on meat in your meals. Exactly how much? About 350 grams of meat per week. So in the Australian Dietary Guidelines, environmental sustainability was included as a background document, as I said, and it was actually made available as an appendix. It covered off on a number of the health principles listed in the FAO guiding principles, the environmental principles, and the sociocultural. So it covered all of these 3 domains. It covered the what, why, and how really well, but not the quantity. So it didn't provide any specific advice for people. So in terms of this review, 44% of the countries that we looked at included environmental sustainability in their dietary guidelines, but that covers just 19% of countries in the world. It's encouraging to see that there's been an increase in the inclusion of environmental sustainability in guidelines published, particularly in the last 10 years. But in many instances, the discussion around environmental sustainability lacks specific details. And in relation to the FAO's suggestion around making these recommendations more informative, accessible, we still need some work on exactly how people can make those dietary changes in the context of their country's eating patterns. There's clearly a little bit of a way to go in terms of really providing that useful baseline information for people to make those dietary changes. So the opportunities for dietary guidelines in Australia is to really be based on contemporary guidance temporary advice and the latest scientific evidence from multidisciplinary areas, and provide guidance that is contextualized to our current food preferences and current dietary habits, and really give Australians an understanding of why it's important and how to make that change with really actionable advice. And that leads me to the second part of the work I'll be presenting on today, which is how do Australian diets compare to global and national dietary guidelines. So we're probably all familiar with the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet. It got a lot of media attention in 2019 when it was launched. There's some similarities between that or the presentation of that reference diet and our National Australian Dietary Guidelines, in that they're both presented in a plate style pattern with food groups sort of demarcated in the proportion with which we should eat them. So Eat Lancet was published in 2019, and our Australian Dietary Guidelines were published about 6 years prior to that in 2013. So in this particular study, we wanted to model different Australian dietary patterns using population survey data. We used data from the Australian National Nutrition and Physical Activity Survey, which was conducted in 2011-12. So it's about 10 years old now, but it's still the most comprehensive survey data nationally representative survey data that we have available. The method of data collection for that was 24-hour recall. We limited this analysis to adults aged 19 to 50. It's the largest group of adults in the survey, comprising about 55% of the adults that are included, and just acknowledging the great team that have been involved in this work as well. So our references were the Planetary Health Reference Diet and the Australian Dietary Guidelines. The Australian Dietary Guidelines were modelled as best possible using the food choices from the Planetary Health modelling. And then we really wanted to compare that to current dietary patterns that exist within Australia. So we didn't want to make anything up. We looked at the data and we chose various dietary patterns within the data. So we looked at the average diet of adults aged 19 to 50. Obviously, the average hides a bit of variation within that population group. So we also looked at males and females. And then sometimes when we're talking about health or environmental sustainability, we tend to take a single-focused or a one-dimensional approach to that. So we sort of explored diets that were lowest or highest in animal meat consumption, because as a product, meat has a high environmental or greenhouse gas impact. Highest and lowest dairy consumption, and for this we took the adults and we broke them into 3 groups from lowest through to highest, and we compared the lowest and the highest consumers of these food groups. Likewise with health, sometimes we tend to focus on, a healthy diet is just one with lots of vegetables, or a healthy diet is just one with very few discretionary foods. So we looked at highest vegetable consumers and lowest discretionary food consumers. And then we also wanted to take this sort of whole of dietary pattern approach, because that's what the dietary guidelines are. So we used a diet quality index that measures compliance against the dietary guidelines. And again, we compared the group of adults with the lowest diet quality and those with the highest diet quality. And for this, we looked at the food group consumption of these various dietary patterns, the nutrient adequacy, and also the environmental impact. And that's what I'll go through quickly now. So when we look at the average diet of Australians aged 19 to 50, the bars are the food group serves per day average, and the triangles on this slide indicate the recommendations in the dietary guidelines. So we can see that the average Australian diet for those aged 19 to 50 falls 1 serve or more short of the recommendations in the dietary guidelines for vegetables, about 1 serve exactly for dairy, cereals, and also unsaturated fats and oils. We overconsume, so while we were under-consuming cereals, that was because we were under-consuming whole grains. We actually overconsume refined grains relative to the dietary guidelines. And obviously, no surprises, we eat twice as many discretionary foods as what is recommended in the dietary guidelines. When we overlay the Planetary Health recommendations, which are the orange squares now, they recommend less vegetables than what the dietary guidelines do. They recommend more cereal-based products. They recommend actually more meat and alternatives because of the inclusion of a large amount of legumes and nuts. And they include more unsaturated fats and oils. So our average Australian diet was lower in vegetables, grains, than both the dietary guidelines and the Planetary Health diet. In terms of meats and alternatives, we were a lot less than the Planetary Health recommendations. And this is largely because of the large recommendation of legumes that is recommended in that diet and Australians don't consume. And then unsaturated fats and oils, as I said. And again, we overconsume discretionary foods relative to both sets of dietary guidelines. So if we have a look at a few other examples, the dietary pattern of Australians who consume the least amount of animal meats. So they consume just over 1 serve of meat and alternatives per day, which is less than the dietary guidelines and the Planetary Health reference diet. It's about equal to those guidelines in terms of red meat and other animal-based meats, so poultry and fish, as you can see there where we break it down. But as I said before, we consume less legumes than both recommendations recommend. And then no surprises with the discretionary foods there. Just adding in dairy foods. So this is the Australians who consume lowest amounts of dairy foods. The pattern is generally similar. Underconsumption of vegetables, whole grains, unsaturated fats, overconsumption of discretionary foods. So just taking another dietary pattern that might be considered a healthy dietary pattern because it's got the most vegetables. This group of Australians, so remember it's that top third of Australians in terms of vegetable consumption, they consume just over 5.5 serves of vegetables per day, which is about spot on in terms of the dietary guidelines recommendations. But still, we have these sort of same old problems with the rest of the diet. So even this group underconsume whole grains and overconsume discretionary foods. And when we overlay the Planetary Health reference diet, because the Planetary Health reference diet includes less vegetables than the dietary guidelines, this group of Australians actually consume more vegetables than what's recommended in that diet. But the rest of the dietary pattern sort of has those same patterns where it's underconsumption of whole grains, unsaturated fats, and overconsumption of discretionary foods. Another dietary pattern that might be considered healthy is those Australians with the lowest discretionary food intake. It's fantastic to see that there is a group of Australian adults who do consume discretionary foods within the recommendations of the dietary guidelines, albeit just a couple of thousand in this survey. So this group of adults did meet the recommendations for both the dietary guidelines and Planetary Health diets. But again, just because that one aspect of their diet was aligning with dietary guidelines, it didn't mean the rest of the diet did. So vegetables were still less than recommended in both sets of benchmarks, less whole grains, less plant-based alternatives, less saturated fats and oils. And finally, the highest quality diet. So this is the dietary pattern that took a more holistic view that had the highest diet quality index score amongst adults aged 19 to 50. What was interesting was, you know, these diets, they weren't perfect. They only scored 60 out of 100. So they still had a lot of room for improvement, but they were the best of what exists in this survey data. So the best possible diets currently existing amongst Australians. They did better across the board, but we still had a couple of key areas where we fell short of the dietary guideline recommendations, be that vegetables and whole grains. As you can see, the bars are a lot closer to the triangles in a lot of other food groups that we've just been talking about. This diet actually also met, when we looked at the nutrient reference values, this diet met all 22 of the nutrients that we looked at, which was pleasing given it only scored 60 out of 100. Sorry, apologies, except for sodium. It didn't meet sodium. So in terms of dietary pattern analysis, across the board, regardless of sort of what angle you take or how you look at diets, Australian diets tend to be low in vegetables, whole grains, and unsaturated fats and oils, and we overconsume discretionary foods. We aren't achieving the food group target intakes of the dietary guidelines or the Planetary Health reference diet. We're quite a bit off both of those recommendations for many of these food groups. And I think what this modelling shows is that just focusing on one aspect of the diet, such as reducing meat or having a high vegetable consumption, doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the diet falls into place and you have a healthier dietary pattern overall. Another part of the dietary guidelines that's often ignored is variety. It's promoted in a few places throughout our dietary guidelines, but isn't spoken about as much as other aspects of the dietary guidelines. Some examples of the wording within the dietary guidelines that refers to variety. It promotes a variety of different types and colours of vegetables, and also a wide variety of foods is mentioned within the meat and alternatives section of the dietary guidelines. So what the modelling showed was that the average Australian diet does not exceed the total amount of lean meats and alternatives recommended in the dietary guidelines or the Planetary Health. But what about the food choices that we're making within this category of foods? Are we sort of meeting this recommendation or this sub-recommendation within the dietary guidelines around variety? This is a bit busy, but I'll just talk you through it. This shows the amount of meat and alternatives that I had on the one day of the survey that's analysed for the average diet, and then also the modelling that we did for the Australian Dietary Guidelines and the Planetary Health Reference Diet. And the proportion that comes from red meat, poultry, and fish are the grey colours, eggs is the very light grey, and then the legumes and nuts are the green colours. So you can see that in the average Australian diet, 44% of our meat and alternatives are coming from red meat. Another 37 or so is coming from fish, seafood and poultry combined, and only a small amount is coming from legumes and nuts. In the dietary guideline, there's a more even spread across the different types of meat and alternatives, with 25% from red meat, about 50% from nuts and legumes, and the rest from the white meats, poultry and fish. And in the Planetary Health Reference Diet, you can see a very small recommendation for red meat. So less than 5% of the total meat and alternative choices is recommended to come from red meat, and a huge, 82% or so of nuts and of meat and alternatives is recommended to come from nuts and legumes. So very different to how we currently eat as Australians. Just showing you a couple of the other examples with the different dietary patterns. Even amongst our lowest and highest meat consuming subgroups, yes, there's twice as much, I guess, in terms of proportion coming from red meat, but we're still nowhere near the recommendations of the Planetary Health Reference Diet. The group of Australian adults who consume the lowest amount of animal meats, they have proportions that are most similar to the Australian Dietary Guidelines. About a quarter of their meat and alternative choices coming from red meat, about another quarter to a third from the white meats, and about a quarter from the nuts and legumes. Just quickly, when we look at the environmental impacts of a few of the different diets we used a combined index of environmental impact, which included a measure of the climate footprint, water scarcity and cropland footprints. The average Australian diet in the modelling that we did had about 9,200 kilojoules. The highest quality diets, so those with the highest dietary guideline index score, the top third there, they had a similar kilojoule content of their diet for an equivalent environmental impact. So moving from the current average diet, across to the highest quality existing diet, not the best that you could do, but the best of amongst what Australians are currently doing. Isocaloric, same environmental impact, however, a lot more nutrition because of the higher core food consumption and less discretionary food consumption. So nutrition gains without necessarily environmental impact gains. If we move to the dietary guidelines, you get a 30% reduction in environmental impacts from those two other dietary patterns we were just talking about. And again, further reduction if we move to the Planetary Health reference diet. So just in terms of summary, I think hopefully it's been clear that regardless of the benchmark used, whether that be the dietary guidelines or Planetary Health reference diet, Australians' diets are low in vegetables, whole grains and unsaturated fats and oils, and we really overconsume discretionary foods. National dietary guidelines really need, and they do, consider the current food preferences. And that's really important to ensure that dietary guidelines are realistic and practical to adopt. They're only as good as the number of people who adopt them, really. Dietary guidelines can only really realise those health and environmental benefits if people are adopting them. So this realistic, practical, how-to type advice is critical so that people are able to make the behaviour changes needed to align their food choices and their dietary patterns with what is recommended for health and a more sustainable food system. The inclusion of environmental sustainability in food-based dietary guidelines is very often focused on the what, and very few address the how. How can these changes be made? How much should I be eating? And again, that's really important for implementing these healthier, more sustainable diets. And I think that's where dietitians come in as the how-to type advice. But whenever we're developing dietary advice, it's difficult because there's these trade-offs between health, environment, nutrition. So there just really needs to be this three-way kind of consideration. Some changes you'll gain health, you'll gain nutrients without necessarily environmental impacts, and vice versa. Sometimes there are environmental impacts without the health benefits. And so I think these research findings really support this whole of diet approach instead of that single focused reductionist type approach. Thanks very much.